Thanks for the introduction. So my name is Zhiyun Chen. I'm a professor from the University of California, Riverside. We are a group of academic researchers across several institutions. Besides UCR, we have folks from Zhejiang University and Jilin University. All of us love OS kernel security, which brought us together. And the students did all the great work, and I'm just really happy here to present on behalf of our terrific team. Okay, so let's get right into OS kernel exploits. At a high level, I'm sure most of you know that there are two common types of techniques to achieve privilege escalation today: control flow hijack and data-only attacks. And control flow hijack involves manipulating control data, such as function pointer, to redirect the execution to an attacker-controlled location, and to redirect and to facilitate the return-oriented programming attack, typically. And data-only attacks, on the other hand, corrupt data pointers instead, which often lead to arbitrary read and write capabilities. And these are useful for ultimately corrupting some key OS data, such as CRED and UID. Okay. Now, with the rising popularity of control flow integrity, however, control flow hijack is becoming more and more difficult, and this calls for more data-only attack techniques. I believe those would be more and more useful in the future. And in fact, we surveyed publicly available kernel exploits against CVEs in Linux and Android in recent years, and found that the number of data-only attacks are clearly on the rise. And here the green bars represent the number of exploits conducting data-only attacks. Okay, so let's take a closer look at data-only attacks. Typically, there are two types of critical OS data that are targeted: global variables, such as mod-probe paths, or heap variables, such as CRED. So what is mod-probe paths? Well, mod-probe paths stores the file path to the mod-probe binary, and it is used by the kernel to execute the binary with root privilege. So overriding the mod-probe path global variable can then lead to attacker-controlled binary to run as root, and therefore privilege escalation. However, to write to this variable, one must first bypass KASLR, as the address of the global variable is randomized. And furthermore, an arbitrary address write primitive is needed. Otherwise, we can't write exactly where we want. And finally, because mod-probe path is a popular target, there's actually a kernel option that protects the variable and makes the file path static. And then there are these heap variables, such as CRED and file, corrupting critical fields such as UID and fmode can lead to privilege escalation. I'm sure you know UID being 0 means that the process is essentially a root. And for fmode in the file object represents the file permission. So you can imagine changing a read-only file to a writable one can enable privilege escalation. So in comparison with global variables, heap variables can be more desirable for data-only attacks. And this is because an attacker can easily spray such objects on heap and use relative writes, such as out-of-bound write, as opposed to arbitrary address write. So in theory, this means that an attacker may not even need to derive an arbitrary address write, which is typically not easy. And also, the attacker doesn't even need to worry about KASLR, because there is no write to an absolute address. Right? It's all relative. Unfortunately, most vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel happen in the generic heap caches, whereas most critical heap objects are in dedicated caches. And CRED is a good example. So the question is, can we use relative writes to reach such isolated heap objects? The answer is yes. And all we need to do is to perform some kind of cross-cache attacks. And by the way, this is not our invention. But I want to quickly go over some background on how previous data-only attacks work and then come to our attack. Right. So, and depending on the type of vulnerabilities, typically what you do with cross-cache attacks is, more or less, there are always ways to do it, but they're not as reliable or as future-proof. For example, for OOB, you could arrange the memory layout in such a way that you can write across caches. And for UAF, it's a little better, but it's not future-proof. So overall, the cross-cache challenge is still a significant hurdle for today and tomorrow's exploits. And next, I will go over OOB and UAF cross-cache attack techniques, just briefly. So let's consider the OOB write case. The cross-cache challenge prevents us from spraying victim objects onto a generic cache, and so we can't really corrupt the victim within the cache. But what we can do is to perform what's called page fengshui, and cause the two different caches to be adjacent in memory. In other words, the OOB write will have to go across caches. Unfortunately, doing so requires a bit of luck, because the location and the distance between the two objects are uncertain, especially with new mitigations enabled in the kernel. And another way to overcome the cross-cache challenge is to pivot the OOB write into a double free or use after free. And the idea is to use OOB write to corrupt the lower bits of some heap data pointer, which can be found in many heap objects. For example, the list head field of the message object contains the next and previous pointers. And let's use a prior exploit to explain how this works. And the reason I'm going to explain this prior exploit is that its opening is kind of similar to what we want to do. So as we can see here, there is an array of message objects, each with a next pointer pointing to some next object. So when there's an OOB write vulnerability, let's say this pink object, xt table info, right? If it can go out of bounds and corrupt the next pointer, what happens is that because we corrupt only the lower bytes of the pointer, it'll have a high probability of pointing to an object that has already been pointed to, right, by a different pointer. So in this case, we can see that there are two red arrows pointing to the same object. Right? So then what do? Well, the attacker can then free the object using one of the pointers, and the other one will automatically become a dangling pointer. All right, so that's how the pivot to a double free or use after free can happen. All right, so essentially with this dangling pointer, we are able to free the object again or use the freed memory. Okay? So now that we have a UAF primitive, how do we achieve privilege escalation? Well, it turns out that we still need to overcome two main challenges, including the cross-cache challenge previously discussed. But with UAF, things are a little easier. Right? What we can do is just first spray some vulnerable object along with a bunch of padding objects. We then free the vulnerable object, leaving a dangling pointer. But in addition to the vulnerable object, we're also going to free the other padding objects, and this will cause the entire cache and its pages to be freed. And finally, the freed cache pages can now be reused to allocate victim objects such as CRED objects. Right? So all we need to do then is to directly corrupt such objects using the dangling pointer, which we previously had. While this technique still works today, an upcoming mitigation called slab virtual may kill such page reuses or cache page reuses across different types of objects. Right? So we still needed some new ideas. Now, the second challenge, in addition to cross-cache, is the fact that a relative write primitive oftentimes can corrupt more than what we want, causing side effects. So what do we mean by side effects? Well, in short, it happens when we accidentally corrupt something that we shouldn't, which may cause the system to crash. So let's look at the example victim object here, which is a struct file type. It has a critical field called fmode, which we mentioned before. The figure is probably too small to see, but essentially there are many different fields in a struct file object, and the fmode one is the one that we would like to corrupt for a privilege escalation. But sometimes an exploit primitive may not corrupt only the fmode field. And for example, if it accidentally corrupted the other field, which is fob, which is it's a critical field, the kernel will crash, right? And that's why we call it a side effect. And in practice, there is no guarantee, like I said, that a UAF write or even an OOB write will perfectly match the offset of fmode, right, in the target object. And therefore, to avoid side effects, oftentimes what people do is they'll do additional steps to write correct values into these fields, right, if we have to corrupt them, which would require bypassing KASLR or using some other infoleak. Okay, so to summarize, let's review the steps of a typical modern-day kernel exploit. First, depending on how strong the initial primitive is, we may pivot it to some other exploit primitive, and then we would need to bypass the KASLR, most likely, deal with the cross-cache challenge, and finally corrupt the target object while avoiding side effects. So then we ask ourselves, what can we do to overcome the previously mentioned challenges and improve the exploit process? For example, can we avoid some of these steps or make some of these steps smoother? And to answer the questions, we took the inspiration from recent vulnerabilities that provide page-UAF primitive. Now, what is a page-UAF? Well, a page-UAF allows a freed physical page to be accessible through some kind of dangling reference. And this means that even though the physical page is unmapped, an attacker can still freely access the physical page. And even better, if the physical page is later mapped to a virtual page, the dangling reference would still allow us to access the physical page, effectively bypassing any mitigations set up in the virtual memory layer. Right. So that's sort of our inspiration and motivation. So obviously, if you have already a page-UAF primitive, it's actually fairly straightforward to then achieve privilege escalation. So let's say if we already have a dangling reference to a freed page, a physical page, right? We can then spray objects that will cause the kernel to allocate the physical page, meaning these objects will be now stored on this page. And then we can then simply corrupt these objects using the dangling reference to write into the page, right? Easy peasy. But the problem is, most of the time, a vulnerability won't give us a page-UAF primitive, right, initially. So what can we do? Right? Can we somehow pivot common types of vulnerabilities to a page-UAF primitive. And so that's exactly what we did. We developed PageJack that is essentially a new exploit technique that will pivot common vulnerabilities such as OOB, UAF, or double free into a page-UAF primitive. Right? And subsequently, it would allow us to corrupt some target objects fairly easily. Okay, so let's take a look at how PageJack works by walking through an OOB example. Right? By the way, PageJack is not just limited to OOB. I'm using it only as an example here. But if you're interested in seeing more details, you can read our white paper linked at the end for more details. So this process is a little involved, so I'm going to do this slowly. On the left figure, there are 3 layers of memory that we want to illustrate. And let's walk through them one by one. And at the top, we can see the attacker has already arranged the memory layout such that a vulnerable object in blue is adjacent to 2 pipe buffer objects. And a pipe buffer object has a page pointer that points to a page struct or page object in the next layer. And by the way, the figure on the right shows the object definitions in case you want to see them. And to clarify, these page objects in the middle themselves are not physical pages. And instead, they're 64-byte objects, as we can see on the right for their definitions. But each of the page object does correspond to a physical page, which is shown in the 3rd layer. And through proper system calls, one can use the page object to then reach the physical page. So in this particular example, we can make system calls that operate on the pipe buffer, which would then lead us to the page object, which would then finally lead us to the physical page. Right? So we could read and write a physical page through a pipe buffer object. Okay? So that's sort of the basic premise of this. Yeah, so there's some animation here that shows how you would go from the pipe buffer to the physical page. But after the basic introduction, what do? Well, the attacker would then just trigger a OOB write to corrupt the page pointer in the first pipe buffer object from the blue object. Right, this is similar to what we previously discussed in a prior exploit. But the goal here is to pivot the OOB write into a UAF of a page object. Right? And if things go well, the 2 pipe buffer objects will both point to the same page object. Right? As you can see that the 2 pointers now are pointing to page object number 2. And a bit more details on the pointer corruption. Right? Because a page pointer is only 64-byte long, all we need to do is to write the lowest byte of a page pointer to hexadecimal 00. Right? And we will have a 75% chance of success in creating the double reference. If it fails, it is basically because the original byte is already 0x00. In which case, the write would basically have no effect, and the attacker can simply try it again. Okay? So now, let's say we have 2 pointers pointing to the same page object. What we do is we will trigger a free using one of the pointers, similar to what we saw before. And what's really interesting here is the free of a page object, right? It doesn't just free the page object. Right? In fact, it'll also free the corresponding physical page. Right? As we can see, the gray object and the gray page. So from the operating system's perspective, that entire 4 KB physical page is now available for reuse. right? So basically, it goes back to the body allocator. And at this point, we have successfully created a dangling pointer, as shown in the red arrow. Well, now what do? Well, we basically spray critical victim objects now that we have a freed physical page. And we can spray any objects we like, such as CRAD and file objects. In this example, we sprayed file objects. And it can basically be allocated in this freed physical page. And note that the upcoming slab virtual mitigation can't really stop the attack because only virtual pages are tracked by slab virtual. And here, we're actually targeting physical pages directly. And that's why we're able to bypass the new mitigation. And finally, we can simply use the dangling pointer to then read and write the physical page, which now holds critical objects, right? In this case, file objects. And by overriding the F-mode field, which represents the file permission again, we can get privilege escalation because the attacker now can write to something like etc password, for example. Okay, so this is the core idea of the PageJack technique. Essentially, we manipulated these middle layer page objects to indirectly manipulate physical pages. Okay, so let's walk through a real CVE to demo the PageJack again. And this CVE again is a OOB write vulnerability. It has actually two different OOB write primitives. The second one can write a single bit out of bound, which is what we will use for our exploitation. Similar to the steps shown before, we have a vulnerable object, in this case a type filter object in blue, and two other pipe buffer objects arranged right after. And remember, each page buffer has a page pointer pointing to a page object, which is associated with the physical page. Right? And then from here on, we can trigger the second OOB write to corrupt the 6th bit of the page pointer and causing two pointers to now point to the same page object and therefore corresponding to the same physical page. Right. We then close one of the pipe buffers to essentially free the corresponding page object and the physical page, creating a UAF primitive, right? Basically leaving another dangling pointer. And next, we spray file objects for etc password, which will be allocated in the page that was just freed. We then directly write into the F-mode field of the object, right, avoiding the corruption of any other fields. And once we change the permission from read to write, we can now edit the password file to gain root privilege. And by the way, before we write, we could also read ahead of time to see if the sprayed object is indeed allocated successfully in that exact page, which is a really nice property. Okay, so here is a quick demo. We've actually ported slab virtual mitigation and enabled CFI, and we show that our attack would still work. Okay, so initially, we show that we're not a root user, and show the kernel version, the mitigations that are enabled. And if we run our exploit, give it a second, we have now modified the password file. And if we enter the new password, we're now root. All right, cool. So as we can see, our PageJack exploit doesn't require bypassing KASLR at all. It also doesn't need to worry about any cross-cache challenge, right? All because we're targeting physical pages directly. And this has a significant impact on the kernel exploit process. It has made it a lot easier, a lot more streamlined. Okay, so in summary, we proposed a novel data-only attack, and because it's a data-only attack, we don't need to worry about CFI. Naturally, the technique applies to both Linux and Android kernels, and can support OOB, UAF, and double-free vulnerabilities. And finally, it can bypass many mitigations, including some of the latest and upcoming ones. And because it manipulates physical pages directly, it can bypass defenses set up in the virtual memory layer. It also requires fewer steps, naturally making our technique more robust and more stable. And if you're interested in this technique, we have open sourced a number of exploits for some recent CVEs. We also have a detailed white paper that you can refer to. Feel free to contact me or any of our team members. We're happy to chat more. But if you have questions, please also come up and ask. So outside of this work, our group at UCR also published a number of open source tools for automated bug triaging and exploitability analysis. So figuring out which kernel bugs are more promising with stronger exploit primitives and so on. Feel free to give them a try. Hopefully, it'll make your exploit dev process a little easier. With that, thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
What mitigations are available, or do you propose? Mitigations.
I'm sorry, can you speak a little louder?
Mitigation. What mitigations are available, or do you propose to prevent PageJack?
Mitigations, okay. So we haven't thought too much about what kind of new mitigations can be effective against PageJack. I guess one of the things we could do is physical, isolation at the physical page layer, which is no longer constrained to the virtual memory layer. But at this point, it's unclear how expensive or how easy it is to implement something like that.